DNC, Doctrine, and Cankers. Hello, I'm Kendall Brian Hunter, author of the book Consider My Servant Job. Makes a great jack-o'-lantern stuffer, turkey stuffer, stocking stuffer, Epiphany stuffer, St. Valentine's Day stuffer. Good for any holiday. I'm Kendall Brian Hunter, author of the book Consider My Servant Job, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point, where I always show up, I always come prepared, we never take roll, and it's bring your own refreshments. Today's refreshment is Visine. My eyes are really puffy. What's going on is I work at a hospital, and a couple of weeks ago there was a fire at the hospital. So hospitals are very good about putting out fire. So there's not a lot of fire damage, but a whole lot of water damage from the sprinklers, which means we've been having the disaster cleanup people there drying out everything for about a week, and now they're replacing a whole bunch of sheetrock. So when I show up to work, there's just a lot of dust there. And then on top of that, my blessed upstairs neighbor, they've been having a problem with a leak from upstairs, and right now they're replacing. It was starting to leak in our bathroom, and so they had a leak from their sink, and it went into our bathroom. That's been going on for about 3 or 4 weeks now, and they're finally replacing it. So everywhere I go, work and home, there's a whole lot of dust from sheetrock, and so it's starting to get into my eyes. So yeah, Visine, and then certainly in a week from now, everything should be cleared up. So that's my eyes, and that's refreshment for today. So here we are. This was a long reading assignment across 4 books and 14 chapters, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. And these are pastoral epistles. They're not written to cities or congregations, but they were written to individuals, which is kind of interesting. It's a little bit different tone. It's more personal. You're not giving general counsels like when they have the... it's a little bit like when you read the difference between reading the scriptures and reading your patriarchal blessing, that there's a general counsel, and sometimes it applies, sometimes it doesn't. For example, Elder Anderson's talk and President Nelson's comments on tithing. If you're a full tithe payer, that's nice, didn't apply to you, so congratulate yourself and move on. But these are specific counsel. 1st and 2nd Timothy were a little bit of an overlap, and what happened is the one to Titus. Titus was a leader of the church in Greece. Let me get my Bible out and make sure I'm doing this right. Lick, James, epistles. So, 1st, 2nd Titus, Timothy, Titus, so 3 T's, then Philemon. And Philemon is interesting. We'll talk about it a little bit later. It's a letter to a person who had a runaway slave that converted to the church, and so it brings up some issues about slavery and Christianity. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the doctrinal aspects in 1st and 2nd Timothy, and also a little bit in Titus. So, and there's a reason why. I lived in a ward where we had this small cluster. It was 3 of the former bishops, and then you had the hippie, and they were all high priests, and the small cluster of brethren kind of got off into some speculative areas. They'd go off on tangents here and there. So some of it actually did cross over into false doctrine. But you have the small cluster of 3 high priests, and the status as being 4 high priests, and 3 of them being former bishops, gave the color of legitimacy. And Paul uses this word, so I'll use it, heresy and heretics. And I watched as it had an effect upon the ward. It certainly had an effect upon me. And I'd watch as good people would kind of knuckle under, and some eventually moved out to protect themselves, but certainly to protect their children from this. And Paul addresses the same issue as what do you do when you show up to church and people are teaching false doctrine in testimony meeting and sacrament meeting talks and quorum or relief society, or not just in our day, we'd add social media. There's just no filter. What do you do when you show up, but also what do you do when church leaders let this go on, and the effect that it has upon people. So for people, critical masses do not have to be massive. Think of the Sons of Mosiah, Alman, the Sons of Mosiah, 5 people who are just did a lot of stuff in the Book of Mormon, and the same thing can happen to a small ward. So 1 Timothy 1 begins with a problem of false teachers and false doctrine. The Book of Mormon also addresses this. 2 Nephi 28 is an entire chapter about false churches. Words of Mormon and verses 15 and 16 talks about how King Benjamin had to deal with false Christs, false prophets, false teachers. 4th Nephi verses 26 and 27 talk about these churches that enabled wickedness, people building churches unto themselves. Build a church unto yourself, a flattering church, a church that enables you. So this is not a tangential issue limited to Paul's dispensation. It's one that just constantly goes on. So keep in mind, the purpose of the commandments are to, the end of the commandment is charity, 1 Timothy 1:15, but you have these false teachers mentioned in both epistles, and here's some of the symptoms. That they teach no other doctrine, neither give heed to fables and endless genealogy, which minister questions, rather than godly edifying, which is in faith. So do. So he talks about the teaching, but also the type of questions. And we get this discussion that, it's okay to ask questions, but there's also an assumption too, I think it was Elder Renlund used the whack-a-mole analogy, that you ask a question, then you ask another one. The point is not to get an answer, but to just keep asking questions as a type of fusillade and barrage. Some questions are honest. Some questions are edifying. Some questions are about clarification. Some questions are about verification. See, you can be a believer, but still ask questions about verification. Okay, is this document accurate? You saw this on social media. Is that really true? What's your primary source are you citing? And those of you who went to law school know about leading questions, loaded questions. Some questions are just argumentative. Paul talks about foolish and unlearned questions. And so not all questions are equal, and some questions are useful, some aren't. You also have the people who ask these types of questions, the disruptors. 1 Timothy 1, from which some having swerved, having turned aside into vain jangling. Vain jangling, that's King James English at its finest. Desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say nor whereof they affirm. You want a teacher, but you just don't understand what's going on. You can get foreordained, called set apart, but unless you knuckle under and study, it's not going to work, and you're just repeating stuff that you heard other people say, just being in an echo chamber. That doesn't quite work. 1 Timothy 6. He is proud, knowing nothing, but doting about questions and strifes of words, whereof cometh envy, strife, railings, evil surmisings, perverse disruptings of men of corrupt minds, and destitute of the truth. 2 Timothy 2, strive nor about words to no profit. Strive nor I may have transcribed that. I'll double check that. It's about striving about words to no profit. That's getting into semantical discussions. People engage in word thinking. Word thinking, that's a good term. People who process language the same way that a chatbot processes things, going from a definition to an answer instead of from a fact to an answer. You have a definition, but looking at the facts. Those are two different things. It trips. Good people have been tripped up by this. So you have this going on, the teachers and what they teach. And here's Paul's solution, 1 Timothy 6. O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings. Vain babblings, those are the speech makers, people who just go up there and they have to make a speech and they need an audience to get validation. And oppositions of science, falsely so called. So bad translation here, opposition to science. So this isn't a Luddite. We're not advocating a type of Amish approach where we're just stuck in excuse me for a second, the allergies in my eyes. Science just means knowledge. That's what the word science means, is knowledge, like in conscience, conscience. And so, in oppositions of knowledge falsely called, remember the Greeks really weren't big on science as we understand it today with doing experiments. They're more into philosophy, so it'd have a rationalism as opposed to an empiricism approach, which we use today. We do empiricism. In fact, that's an interesting discussion is you have all these empiricists, but they can't do deductive reasoning. 2 Timothy 2:16 and 17. But shun profane and vain babblings, that babblings and jangling again, for they will increase unto more ungodliness. See these babblings lead to ungodliness. And the word will eat as doth a canker, of whom Hymenaeus and Philetus, and those are two of the offenders. They had two people, and the sword I lived in was four. So it says, their word will eat as doth a canker. Now, if you read the footnote to it, it says it will spread as gangrene. Like I said, I work at a hospital, so just yesterday I was coming out of an elevator, and they had moving a patient from the ER up to the floor, and he was bleeding. Gangrene, spread like gangrene. This has an effect when you have one or two people who go off on these tangents, and as the number increases to a critical mass, even four people like the four sons of Mosiah, when they're bad, they can do a lot of damage because it gives a sense of majority and legitimacy to what's going on. Titus 3:10, a man that is a heretic after the first and second admonition reject. So you offer correction. So you give him 2 times and 3 strikes you're out. That's the Lord law of witnesses. That's not baseball. That's the Lord law of witnesses. 3 John 1:9 talks about that, and also Mosiah 26 talks about excommunicating people who are of the generation of Alma the Younger and the 4 sons of Mosiah. Things got to the point where they had to excommunicate them, and ever after they were always remained a separate people. We're seeing that same phenomenon go on today, people who leave the church and they're kind of separate from the rest of this. Not a pleasant picture, and that's something leaders need to get a handle on. Don't let it happen, and if you're the offender, look in the mirror. Sorry, my nose again. Now, another thing they talk about is offices. As you're reading here, go off my tab, I'm kind of shifting around. It's kind of uncomfortable for me. So the offices talks about kings. 1 Timothy 2:2 talks about honoring offices. We have an article of faith to that effect where you honor people in their station in government. Talks about elders, 1 Timothy 1:5. 1 Timothy and 3 and Titus 1 talk about the office of bishop. If you're a bishop, that's good to review it. If you're a man, it's also good to review that because you just might get called as bishop. I don't care what your age is. I've had bishops in their 20s. I've had bishops in their 50s and 60s. So it kind of floats around. There's just no set time for a bishop. If you're a Melchizedek priesthood holder, even if you're an elder, study that. So here's an antinomy or a paradox where you have 2 things in tension. Paul says if a man desires the office of a bishop, he desires a good thing. Now, people talk about coveting callings or aspire to leadership positions, and you read Alma 29, and Alma talks about that, saying I shouldn't, aspire to these callings. I should be content with what the Lord has allotted us. Elder Bednar talked about this in the last conference about no less serviceable and to them at the last wagon. That you have a tension there that if you want to be bishop, that's a good thing, but make sure you're doing both at the same time, that just being content and you're standing in the office that you're set apart for and not trying to second get a bishop or a church leader. So if a man wants to be a bishop, he desires a good thing. Well, what if a woman wants to be a bishop? Stop and think about it. Chew over that. I'm not going to give you a microwave burrito answer on that one. Sit there and think about that. If a woman wants to be a bishop, like I said, if a man desires to be a bishop, and that's a good thing, is it good for a woman? But what's the solution for that? So think over that. Also about deacons. They talk about deacons, 1 Timothy 3, and it talks about deacons needing to be married. Well, President Joseph Fielding Smith answered this question, and it's in his book, Answers to Gospel Questions, Volume 1, page 128. And, early on, you'd have adults would be Aaronic priesthood holders. Wilford Woodruff talked about, yes, he is a priest when he went out on his first mission. That this idea that the Aaronic priesthood is an inspired youth program, that's not quite correct. That got shifted under President Joseph F. Smith, where he started to have that, but it was an incremental thing. In fact, President Joseph F. Smith was ordained an elder when he was, I think, it was 15 or 16 years old. So, yeah, pay attention to that. Understand there's current continuous revelation, and we adapt things. We're not stuck to some other religion. Say, okay, the Bible's the all sufficient, unchanging Word of God. It's like, no, you always get revelation. Counsel to old men, counsel to women. 1 Timothy 5:13. So here's the counsel to the sisters. And withal, they learn to be idle. Let me dim this a bit. Like I said, my eyes are kind of screwy right now. And withal, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but tattlers and also busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. Therefore, that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. Anyways, warning about women gossiping and just kind of zipping around and babbling. Sisters, there's your counsel. How is this? 1 Timothy 2:9. In like manner also, that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with embroidered hair, or golden pearls, or costly array, but which becometh the woman professing godliness with good works. Isaiah says the same thing. Isaiah chapter 3, 2 Nephi 13, warns about women focusing on clothing as a diversion from spirituality. It's easier to buy what was this expensive dress than to work righteousness, to pray for the gifts of the Spirit, to be righteous. Yeah, there's plenty of a counsel to women. It's just that some people don't like that, and so they pretend like there's not counsel. 1 Timothy 2:12, here's the big one. Talks about women keeping silence. So in Joseph Smith translation, 1 Corinthians 14:34, he changes from silence to rule. My understanding would be is having women not usurping the prerogatives of the priesthood. So that's what that means. My understanding is that understanding from the Joseph Smith translation is that it's a bad translation. But also, this comes up every 4 years, and do we need to have the same conversation over again every 4 years? What's causing people not to remember this? That this translation is rule and not silence. But you also have another aspect, is chatting during class. So teachers talking, but sisters nurture relationships by conversation, and teachers talking, and you'll have two sisters talking to each other and not paying attention. Joseph Smith talked about this. Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, page 69. In ancient days, councils were conducted with such strict propriety. In our councils, generally, one will be uneasy, another sleep, one praying, another not, one's mind on the business of counsel, another thinking on something else. And so you're just not unified. And you may be building a relationship or nurturing a friendship by chatting during class, but it affects the whole body. And there's plenty of time to nurture a relationship, just not during class time and not being disruptive. Lastly, are you teaching doctrine? Or are you teaching the commandments of the Barbie movie? Where are you getting your ideas from? The Family Proclamation or the Feminine Mystique? So, slaves. And this is a big topic. This is, you read about slavery being regulated in the Old Testament, and it carries over into the New Testament because they lived in a society where slavery was legal, unlike today where it's illegal. So, in the book of Philemon, you have, I wrote this wrong in my notes, I got to fix this, is that you have the member who's Philemon, he's a member of the church, and they think Aphia is his wife. And they had a slave named Onesimus, and his name in Greek means useful or handy. And what happened is Onesimus was a runaway slave who converted to Christianity. And this is how Paul sorts it out. He writes this letter, he's telling Titus, slavery is illegal in the Roman Empire, but it's not compatible with Christianity. So go back there and accept Onesimus as a brother. He joined the church, and that's just sort of an outwork of it. That he's no longer a slave; he's your brother because he's accepted Christ. And it was an incremental process. We had the same problem this dispensation, where it was restored in an area where in the United States slavery was legal. You can read about in section 134, verse 12, where it talks about slavery, what the counsel to the church was, and also with Joseph Smith's presidential platform, he was kind of early on, he was just sort of said, well, we don't worry about it. We're not an abolitionist church. We're kind of focusing on this. But later on, he advocated abolition when he was running for president. So there you go. I'm running out of time. We're almost at 20 minutes, and I try and keep us under 15, but we had a lot of stuff to do. A lot of chapters to cover. That's really full. This is a nice one. It's not super dense like Hebrews or Romans, but it is a mindful to read this. He has counsel to Timothy: despise not your youth. Don't neglect the gift. 1 Timothy 6, where he talks about general counsels, what it means to be a disciple in general. So last days, like I said, a lot of stuff in 14 chapters. This will keep you hopping, and don't let this interfere with your study of the General Conference talks. Last days, 1 Timothy 4 and 2 Timothy 3. So are you keeping score? You have these signs of the times listed, and are you paying attention? Instead of going to these wacko sites, or if you have any heretic high priest in your ward, kind of following them, going off on their own tangents, or are you paying attention to what the scriptures have to teach? You also have Paul's farewell. So Paul says, I've fought the good fight, I've finished my course, I've kept the faith. That's just scripture at its finest. But also he talks about the cloak that I left at Troas with Carpus, when thou comest, bring with thee, and the books, but especially the parchments. So he wanted his books, or presumably scrolls, but also the parchments. And we think these parchments may be the New Testament manuscripts. So he wanted his cloak just for temporal stuff, but also the spiritual stuff, making sure that, kind of like with 116 pages, you're taking good care of the scripture that you're given. So here we're at 21:18, but there's a lot of stuff here, so I will finish up with the Christ quotient. First of all, we're learning a lot about order and regulation, how you have people regulate themselves, order within the family. But we're studying the branches of things, behavior, how to manage stuff, but the duties and offices. But what's the root? Well, the root of David is Jesus Christ. That's one of his titles, the root and offspring of David. And sometimes we get bogged down in these leadership meetings talking about branches that we miss the point. We're not connecting this to Christ. We have all these severed branches in a pile. Here's a branch, here's a branch, here's a branch, but where's the living tree? Where's the tree of life? Make sure you're leading people to Christ first, or like I do last. Paul's not ashamed of the gospel. When you get on social media or in social situations, do you succumb to social pressure? Are you standing firm in your testimony? That doesn't mean you barrage or ramrod things, but are you having a quiet confidence, and are you able to stand back and speak up a natural, normal way with soft tones, the still small voice? Don't be ashamed. Lastly, a little bit review of the false doctrine, heresy, and heretics. So in the Joseph Smith Manual in chapter 13, President Joseph F. Smith says, false doctrine comes from two people who are lazy and proud. The people just don't bother to study, and the people just have want to force their opinion and aggrandize themselves and show off and posture. And so you have the gift of discernment to figure out what's going on. Now, like I said, critical masses do not need to be massive. Critical masses do not need to be massive. That you have the four sons of Mosiah, plus Alma the younger, so 5 people did a lot of damage. On the other hand, the 4 sons of Mosiah and Alma were able to do Alma stayed put, and the 4 sons of Mosiah went out as missionaries to convert the Lamanites. And so you have this critical mass of 4 men, plus the other people like Muloki going out doing missionary work, and they're really quite successful with it among the Lamanites. So you have a critical mass to be a negative and a critical mass to be a positive. Think about just 4 individuals or 4 families in your ward that they can be a massive multiplier. You choose to be the person who's a multiplier for the positive. Choose to be one of these, part of the critical mass. Lastly, enduring to the end. Paul is able to endure the end, and that's what we're supposed to do. As I'm at the end of this podcast, endure to the end. And what's the end? Is the end of your life. But who's the end? The end is Jesus Christ, and that's the point.